By mid-September 1944, Peleliu no longer looked like an island. It looked like a furnace hammered into the shape of land. The Marines who came ashore had expected a quick operation. 3, maybe 4 days at most. That was what the briefing said. That was what the planners estimated. Instead, they found themselves fighting across a jagged moonscape of coral ridges, scorched scrub, and cave networks that swallowed entire platoons. Temperatures on the Umurbragol ridges reached 115 degrees in the shade, except there was no shade, only bleached rock that reflected heat like a mirror. Men burned their hands on rifles, canteens boiled, helmets turned into ovens. The sun itself felt hostile, but the worst of it wasn't the heat. It was the Japanese. The enemy had dug into the island long before the Marines arrived, dug deep. Hundreds of interconnected caves, firing pits carved into cliffs, machine gun ports cut into coral, tunnels that let an unseen enemy appear behind you, above you, or vanish seconds before you returned fire. They weren't defending the island. They were inside the island, and among those positions, one in particular had become a nightmare. The Marines called it the Needle Nest, a machine gun pit carved halfway up a jagged ridge, protected by natural coral pillars that made direct assault impossible. The Japanese gunner had a perfect field of fire over a 600-yard stretch of broken ground, and in 2 days he had wounded or pinned down nearly an entire Marine company. Every time someone tried to cross the open ground, the gunner waited, patient, disciplined, and opened fire with short, precise bursts. Never too long. Never enough to draw attention from supporting artillery. Just enough to force the Marines to hug the ground and pray. One Marine said it best. He didn't fire like a normal Jap. He fired like he could see your soul. Platoon leaders tried to flank the position. Impossible. Sheer cliffs on both sides. They tried indirect fire. The pit was too well protected. They tried smoke. The shifting ocean breeze tore it apart instantly. The needle nest had become a problem that couldn't be solved by normal means. That's when the battalion's CO sent for a sniper. Corporal Daniel Harrington, 1st Marine Division, Scout Sniper Platoon, was 22 years old and looked younger. He carried an M19903A1 Springfield, fitted with an 8-power Unertl scope. He also carried a quiet intensity that other Marines noticed immediately. Any man who spent days alone in the jungle, living by silence and patience, tended to have that look. He arrived at the forward line just after dawn. Sweat already rolled off his face, but he moved calmly, almost slowly, conserving every ounce of effort. He dropped into a shallow scrape beside the pinned Marines and asked the lieutenant to point out the target. The lieutenant crawled beside him and whispered, "See that ridge? Middle shelf, 3rd pillar from the left." Harrington raised his binoculars and scanned the slope. He didn't see a machine gun nest. He saw an illusion, a gap in the coral wall no wider than a helmet brim, darkened by shadow, perfectly camouflaged by rock and sun. Only the faintest glimmer of metallic reflection gave it away, and only when the wind hit the right angle. Harrington let out a slow breath. "They've got a master gunner in there," he murmured. The lieutenant nodded. "We've tried everything. He's cut us to ribbons." "How far?" "Our RTFO says between 580 and 620 yards. Can't get closer to range it. Anyone who stands gets ventilated." Harrington lowered his binoculars. "That's fine," he said. "I'll find it myself." Snipers don't look for targets first. They look for positions. Harrington crawled away from the line, backward, sideways, almost snake-like, searching for an angle that wasn't obvious, that wasn't already zeroed in by the Japanese gunner. He moved inch by inch, scanning terrain. He knew the Japanese were watching, always watching. 200 yards back, he found a shallow depression behind a coral outcrop. From there, The ridge wasn't framed head-on. It was angled, off to the right, almost a side view, and that changed the geometry. Mose saw the nest as a slit in rock. From this angle, Harrington saw a shadow, a deeper pocket in the coral, a slight recession where the gun must pivot. He settled in. He unwrapped his shooting mat. He set 2 coral stones under his elbows. He adjusted the rear sand sock. He checked the wind, slight right-to-left drift. He marked it mentally. He dialed in an approximate elevation. He adjusted the parallax on the inertial scope. He slowed his breathing. A shot at 600 yards in Pacific heat shimmer, with humidity warping the air and mirage rising off coral, was not an ordinary shot. It was an act of calculation, intuition, and calm that few possessed. For nearly 20 minutes, Harrington watched the nest. Nothing moved. The breeze shifted, carrying heat across his face. Marines lay behind him in silence, waiting. A stretcher team crouched low, trapped in the open. A wounded man moaned softly. They all depended on Harrington now. Then, a flicker, not movement, a disturbance, the briefest shimmer of light off metal deep inside the slit. Harrington exhaled slowly. The gunner was shifting position. He waited and waited. Then the machine gun barked. A short burst, deliberate, expertly disciplined. Dust kicked up near the Marines. They gritted their teeth. But Harrington didn't flinch. In that instant, he saw what he had been waiting for, the faintest silhouette of a helmet and cheekbone, framed by shadow. The target window was less than 3 inches wide. The margin for error was microscopic. He placed the crosshairs where flesh met darkness. He stopped breathing. He pressed the trigger. The Springfield cracked. Recoil pushed into his shoulder. Dust rose around the muzzle. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the machine gun fell silent. For a full 5 seconds after Corporal Harrington fired, the battlefield held its breath. The Springfield's crack echoed across the coral ridges and died in the thick, oppressive heat. No birds stirred, no wind rustled the scrub. Even the Marines, pinned down behind broken coral, didn't dare whisper. Silence. The kind of silence that comes only when death has just passed through a place. The machine gun, so precise, so disciplined, so cruelly patient, remained quiet. No return burst, no probing fire, no shift of angle, no metallic rattle of a gunner adjusting the feed tray or firing position, just stillness. Lieutenant Ferris, crouched behind a chunk of coral 30 yards forward, slowly raised his head an inch, then froze again. He waited for a retaliatory burst. Nothing. He rose another inch. Still nothing. He lifted his binoculars. "Corporal," he called softly. I think you hit him." Harrington didn't answer. He remained prone behind the rifle, watching the nest through the scope. Snipers knew better than to celebrate. A missed shot could lull a machine gunner into adjusting his position, exposing himself again. A wounded gunner might play dead. A second gunner might be waiting to bait someone into standing. He needed confirmation, so he waited. The heat mirage. The sun climbed higher, cooking the ridgeline until shimmering heat distorted every sharp edge of coral. At 600 yards, the air seemed to ripple like water. Through this wavering lens, Harrington studied the nest for the smallest sign of life. A flicker of shadow, a shift of helmet, a hint of muzzle movement, nothing. But then, something subtle, something easy to miss. Inside the wreckage of the small opening, a faint dust plume drifted downward. Not from gunfire, there was none. It was the kind of settling dust that followed a violent impact inside a confined space. The lieutenant whispered, "Dan, that looked like collapse." Harrington nodded. He slumped forward. The dust came from him hitting the back wall. It was still not enough. Pinned Marines began crawling toward Harrington. They wanted to break the deadlock, to move their wounded out, to reorganize their line. But Harrington raised a hand and gestured for them to stop. "Not yet," he said quietly. If the gunner was alive, even barely, he could kill half a squad before anyone reached cover. Machine gun crews often worked in pairs. The assistant gunner might still be there, crouching behind a rock, ready to pull the weapon into firing position. A machine gun nest did not die easily. Harrington knew what he had to do. He had to get closer. He left his rifle where it lay and pulled out his M1911 pistol. Not because he expected close combat, but because the lighter weapon made the crawl easier. Then he began moving forward on his belly, elbows and knees scraping the jagged coral. Every inch felt like sliding across broken glass. He crawled 30 yards, 60. His hands bled. The coral cut through his uniform. Sweat dripped into the abrasions, stinging like acid. Behind him, Lieutenant Ferris stared in disbelief. "Why is he going alone?" one Marine whispered. Another answered quietly, with something close to reverence, "Because snipers confirm their own kills." Harrington reached a low ridge that offered partial cover. He paused, raised his binoculars, and reassessed the angle. The machine gun slit stared back at him like a dark eye. Still nothing. He moved again. 50 more yards brought him close enough to see details the scope had blurred at distance. Splintered coral around the slit, blackened scorch marks from repeated muzzle bursts, a small pile of ejected 7.7mm casings. Still no movement. He inched closer. Now he was within 200 yards, close enough that the slightest motion inside that nest would have been visible. He steadied his breathing and whispered, "If you're alive, now's when you'll move." Nothing moved. Not a sound. Harrington moved along a shallow depression, staying low. The sun beat down on him like a hammer. His uniform was soaked. His vision blurred from sweat, exhaustion, and the near-boiling humidity. But he pressed on until he reached a fallen coral block only 20 yards from the nest. He stopped there. Any closer, and he might trigger a reaction from a hidden defender. He needed a visual. He needed proof. He took a risk. He raised his head just high enough to see inside the slit, and he saw the truth. The Japanese gunner was slumped forward, chin on his chest, his hands still touching the grips of the Nambu machine gun. A dark hole pierced his right temple. The bullet had entered cleanly, exactly where Harrington had aimed. One shot, one kill, at over 600 yards. The assistant gunner lay further back in the cave, collapsed behind a fallen ammunition box. Whether he had been struck by the same shot, killed by shrapnel from coral fragments, or fell back in shock before being finished by concussion, Harrington couldn't know. But he was dead too. The nest was neutralized. Harrington exhaled, a long, slow release of tension he didn't know he'd been holding. The ridge seemed to expand outward with that breath, the horizon widening, the battlefield unsticking itself from paralysis. He waved his arms slowly toward the Marines behind him. All clear. The shout that followed wasn't loud. It was too hot, too exhausting, too draining for cheers, but it was full of relief. Marines rose from cover for the first time in hours. Stretcher bearers sprinted forward. Squads moved up to secure ground they had been pinned away from for days. Medics reached the wounded who had been stranded in the open. The entire line breathed again. Lieutenant Ferris approached Harrington, wiping sweat from his brow. "Jesus, Dan," he said quietly. "One shot?" Harrington shrugged, exhausted and dusty, his arms bleeding from coral cuts. "I had a good angle," he replied. Ferris stared at him. "You hit a man you could barely see, inside a slit the width of your thumb from across the island." Harrington cracked a small, tired smile. "Yeah," he said. "Lucky angle." But the Marines knew better. It wasn't luck. It was skill, patience, calculation, and nerves of steel forged in coral and fire. The silence that followed the death of the machine gunner lasted only minutes. On Peleliu, the Japanese never allowed the Marines the luxury of calm. The island was a labyrinth, and every ridge, every cave system, every coral fold hid another threat waiting for its moment. Harrington's single shot had broken open the front line, but it had also stirred the hornets' nest, and the hornets were already moving. As the Marines advanced to secure the newly opened ground, the enemy reacted with unnerving speed. Japanese infantry began shifting within the ridge network, using tunnels invisible to American maps. Scouts reported seeing shadows flicker behind slits in the coral far up the slope. A few minutes later, the ridge erupted in scattered rifle fire and the distant rattle of a light machine gun being repositioned. They weren't firing at random. They were looking for the sniper. Word had spread quickly among the Japanese defenders. Their most effective gunner, one who had held the ridge alone for days, was dead, and the shot that killed him had been clean, surgical, precise. It didn't take a strategist to understand someone with exceptional marksmanship had arrived on the battlefield, and the Japanese had a tradition: snipers must die first. Harrington understood that immediately. As he and Lieutenant Ferris moved back toward friendly lines, bullets snapped overhead, far too close to be coincidence. "They've got eyes on you," Ferris said, ducking behind a jagged coral outcrop. "Let them look," Harrington replied, scanning the upper ridge. "I'll look back." He crawled into a shallow depression, returned to prone position, and aimed his Springfield up the hillside. His breathing steadied. His heart slowed. The battlefield noise faded. He became cold again, focused, the way snipers must be. Japanese troops began emerging from a cave mouth higher on the ridge, using a narrow, cleft-like opening in the coral. The first man sprinted low across a ledge, rifle in hand. Harrington tracked him, waiting for a clean shot. Not yet. He was too close to cover. The second soldier emerged, followed by another wearing a white headband, a fire team leader. He paused just long enough for Harrington to settle the crosshairs. The sniper exhaled. The trigger broke cleanly. The round struck the leader center mass, snapping him backward. Before the other two soldiers could react, Marine riflemen opened fire from below. The ridge erupted into staccato violence, but the Japanese weren't retreating. They were repositioning. More muzzle flashes sparked from higher up, taking advantage of the vertical angle. Bullets punched into coral around Harrington's position. Chips of limestone stung his cheek and arms. "They're trying to flank us," one Marine yelled. Ferris shouted back, "Form a skirmish line. Push toward the left folds." But Harrington didn't move. He stayed focused on the ridge above. Somewhere up there was a marksman, someone who had just spotted him. The first indication was a whisper of dust near Harrington's rifle stock, tiny, almost invisible but unmistakable, a near miss. He slid backward, inch by inch, until he was behind a coral spur. The Japanese sniper fired again, this shot sparking limestone off the rock only inches from Harrington's boots. "Dan, you've been marked," Ferris shouted. "Yeah," Harrington muttered. "I noticed." He scanned the ridge. Nothing. The Japanese sniper was good, patient, disciplined, hidden deep behind the folds of coral. Harrington tracked the likely firing angles. Only two positions offered a line to the shot that almost hit him. Both were narrow ledges. One was partially shadowed, barely visible. A glint, just a tiny reflection, sunlight hitting a scope edge or a metal retainer ring. "That's him," Harrington whispered. He rolled to the side, adjusted his rifle, and found the faint silhouette again. The Japanese sniper had the same patience, the same stillness, the same lethal calm. A duel. Two men lying motionless hundreds of yards apart, each waiting for the other to make a mistake. Harrington slowed his breathing until it was barely noticeable. Seconds, 30 seconds, a full minute. Then, a shift of shadow, the slightest movement. Harrington fired. The bullet struck the ledge, sending a spray of coral upward. A figure jerked backward into darkness. Ferris called out, "Did you get him?" "No," Harrington said, "but I moved him." The Japanese sniper did not fire again. For now, with the needle nest eliminated, Marine squads pushed forward in a slow, methodical advance under Harrington's overwatch. Barmen fired long bursts into crevices. Riflemen tossed grenades into cave mouths. Flamethrower teams moved in pairs, their tanks gleaming under the ruthless sun. Peleliu combat doctrine in action. Pin, flank, burn, clear. The progress was violent but steady. Harrington continued scanning the ridge, picking off exposed riflemen and displacing whenever the Japanese tried to target his position. Several Marines clapped him on the shoulder as they passed. "You opened the whole ridge, Harrington." "Hell of a shot back there. You saved half the company." But Harrington didn't react. Compliments didn't matter. What mattered was that the lines had moved, wounded were being evacuated, and momentum was finally shifting. He also knew something else. The Japanese were not finished. They would counterattack soon, as they always did. He checked his canteen. Empty. His uniform was soaked. His cheek rested against the warm wood of the Springfield stock. His eyes burned from sweat and powder grit, but he stayed prone, watching the ridge. When the Japanese came, he would be ready, and he knew the other sniper would be too. Peleliu wasn't done with him yet. The sun slid west across the scarred sky of Peleliu, but the heat didn't drop, not even a degree. The air shimmered above the coral ridges, as if the whole island were breathing fire. Marines had pushed forward nearly 100 yards since Harrington's long-range shot shattered the needle nest's control of the battlefield. But now the advance had stalled again. Not because of machine gun fire, not because of artillery, but because of one man. The Japanese sniper Harrington had wounded, or perhaps only forced deeper into his hide, had re-emerged, and he was good. Within 30 minutes, 3 Marines were hit. 2 were killed instantly, each shot placed with surgical precision from unseen angles. The third man had been kneeling behind a rock when a round clipped his shoulder and buried itself in the sandstone behind him. The line froze, pinned once more. Lieutenant Ferris crawled up to Harrington. "You were right," he whispered, trying to keep his voice low. "He's still alive, and he's hunting us." Harrington nodded. "He's repositioned. He's not firing from the same ledge." "You can find him?" Harrington didn't answer. He didn't need to. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a duel, a contest between 2 men trained in patience, movement, shadows, and instinct. The Marines on Peleliu had seen countless horrors, but nothing matched the quiet terror of a skilled sniper. A machine gun could be suppressed, a bunker could be burned, but a sniper, hidden, disciplined, intelligent, could choke a battlefield without ever being seen. Harrington wiped the sweat from his scope lens and pulled his rifle into position. "Get everyone down," he told Ferris. "Tell them not to move unless I yell." Ferris crawled off, shouting quiet commands, and Harrington became alone again with the silence. Finding a hidden machine gunner at 600 yards had been difficult. Finding a hidden sniper who was actively searching for you was exponentially harder. Harrington scanned the ridge, dividing it mentally into quadrants. Upper ridge, left shelf, right fold, the shadowed alcove that fed into the main cave network. He studied each one with the precision he had practiced for years. Slow, smooth sweeps, never rushing, never letting panic guide his eyes. The ridge seemed motionless, a fossilized wave of coral stone. But Harrington knew the sniper was there, reloading, adjusting, watching. He thought back to the glint he had seen earlier, the moment that revealed the Japanese sniper's firing position. At this hour, the sun had shifted. The angles were different. The light would now strike the ridge from a more horizontal angle, making reflections less likely. He adjusted his magnification. Movement. Not distinct, but a tiny ripple in shadow. Something shifting behind a sliver of coral. Harrington froze, then slowly brought the rifle into position. It wasn't the sniper, but it was something connected to him. A firing blind, a narrow shelf of rock that would give angle on the Marine's position only if someone were prone behind it. And Harrington noticed one more detail, a faint puff of dust drifting from a vent-like crack above the shelf. Breathing. Someone was down there. He scanned again. No helmet visible, no rifle barrel, no shadow of a scope. This wasn't like shooting the machine gunner. This was a ghost in a cave. But Harrington knew that caves concentrated sound. He slowed his breath until he could feel his heartbeat in his cheek against the rifle stock. He tapped the trigger lightly, not firing, just feeling the mechanism. Then he saw it. A silhouette. Tiny, fleeting, but unmistakable. A scope lens reflecting faint ambient light from deep within the cave's recess. The Japanese sniper had repositioned into a cave that angled downward at a shallow slope. It allowed him to fire from shadow while revealing almost nothing, not even a helmet crest. Only a tiny sliver of lens betrayed him. Harrington lined up the shot. It was harder than the 600-yard kill. The distance was shorter, maybe 380 yards, but the target was effectively invisible. He had to shoot a reflection, not a man. He steadied his breathing. He aligned the crosshair a fraction above the glint. He inhaled deeply, then exhaled slowly, and held. The trigger broke. The Springfield cracked. The bullet flew. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, a scream. Short, sharp, unmistakable. The glint vanished. The shadow shifted. A body slumped forward, barely visible in the dark slit. Harrington kept the scope trained for a full 10 seconds, waiting for a second sniper, an assistant, a countershot. Nothing. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "It's done," he whispered. Word spread quickly. Marines rose from the coral and advanced once more. Bar teams swept the lower folds with suppressive bursts. Riflemen climbed the slope cautiously. Flamethrower operators moved forward, ready to purge the remaining cave complex. Harrington stayed behind his rifle, providing overwatch as they advanced into the zone the Japanese sniper had controlled. Marines reached the small cave aperture first. Inside, they found the sniper's body, lean, wiry, with a white hachimaki wrapped around his forehead. His Arisaka rifle lay beside him, scope cracked where the bullet had penetrated. The shot had entered through the lens opening. A 1 in 1,000 hit. Lieutenant Ferris called out, "Harrington, I think this one's yours." Harrington didn't move to inspect his kill. He didn't need to. Snipers don't celebrate, they verify. A Marine radio operator jogged over. "Sir, message from battalion," he said, catching his breath. "They want to know if the ridge is clear for the engineers and medics." Ferris turned to Harrington. "Well?" Harrington looked up the slope, looked at the cave, looked at the Marines now moving freely across ground that had been a killing field only hours before. He finally said, "It's clear." The ridge grew quieter as Marines pushed further ahead. The sun dipped behind the jagged coral spires, casting long shadows. Harrington sat down on a smooth rock, one of the few smooth surfaces on Peleliu, and finally allowed his exhaustion to catch up with him. Ferris sat beside him. "That was one hell of a duel," he said. Harrington didn't answer at first. When he did, His voice was quiet. "He was good," Harrington said. "Really good." Ferris nodded. "But not better." Harrington stared out at the broken landscape, rifle lying across his knees, the metal warm and familiar. "On a different day," he murmured, "maybe he would have got me." Ferris looked at him. But today wasn't that day, and Harrington finally allowed himself a small, tired smile. "No," he said, "not today." The ridge behind them lay silent. The battlefield breathed again. The duel was over. The sniper had won.